glacier that stopped following its own rules. An Argentina documentary script. I need to admit something about my job. For 12 years, I've planned crowd safety around one core assumption. If a natural pattern has held reliably for a long time, you can build a protocol around it and trust the protocol. I design safety plans for large public events in Denver, marathons, festivals, anything that puts thousands of people in one place at a predictable time, and the entire discipline runs on exactly that logic. Weather patterns, crowd flow. The specific way a river of people moves through a choke point. You study the historical pattern long enough, you build barriers and staffing levels around it, and the pattern, in almost every case that matters, holds. I've built a career on believing that a well-documented cycle is close to the safest thing a person can plan around, and I've defended that belief in enough post-incident reviews to have gotten fairly comfortable making the case out loud. Then my friend Valentina called me about a glacier. Valentina Rios and I met in graduate school, in a hazard planning seminar neither of us particularly loved, and stayed close in the specific way people do when they've watched each other survive the same unglamorous coursework. She became a park ranger and field geologist afterward, stationed for the past several years at Los Glaciares National Park in Argentine Patagonia, home to Perito Moreno, one of the most famous glaciers on Earth, roughly 80 kilometers from the nearest town of any real size. She called on a weeknight, her voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard from her before, somewhere between professional urgency and something closer to grief, and asked if I could fly down to help her team review crowd safety protocols at the glacier's main viewing platforms. I asked why a park with decades of established safety procedure suddenly needed outside consulting help. Rather than simply handling the revision internally the way they always had, she told me, flatly, that the procedures had been built around a pattern the glacier had just stopped reliably following, and that she didn't fully trust anyone on her own team, herself included, to redesign safety planning fast enough without a second set of eyes that specialized in exactly this kind of problem. I booked a flight 2 days later. I told my firm I needed 2 weeks for an international consulting engagement, which was true, and left out how little I actually understood about what I was flying toward. On the long flight south, I found myself doing the thing I always do before a site visit, pulling every technical paper I could find on Perito Moreno's historical rupture cycle and rereading the same handful of numbers until they blurred together. Arriving already convinced I understood the shape of the problem. I'd seen the postcard photos of Perito Moreno, everyone's seen the towering blue-white wall of ice. The crowds gathered to watch it calve into turquoise water, and I assumed, the way I assume most things I haven't personally investigated, that whatever Valentina needed help with was a manageable adjustment to an already solid system. I didn't yet understand that the system's entire foundation had just quietly shifted under everyone's feet. El Calafate meets you as a small, wind-scoured town, built almost entirely around one nearby attraction, the kind of place whose economy runs so directly on a single natural feature that you can feel the dependency in the air before anyone explains it to you. Hotel signs, tour operator, storefronts, and restaurant menus all quietly orbiting the same 80-kilometer drive out of town. Valentina picked me up from the airport looking more tired than I remembered from our last conference together, and didn't waste much time on small talk before we were driving out toward the park. The flat Patagonian steppe giving way gradually to forest, and then, all at once, to a wall of ice visible from a genuinely improbable distance. Perito Moreno is part of the southern Patagonian ice field, the third largest reserve of freshwater ice outside the polar regions, feeding dozens of glaciers across the border between Argentina and Chile. What makes Perito Moreno famous historically is that it has spent the better part of the last century doing something almost no other glacier on the planet does, advancing, its ice front pushing forward roughly 2 meters a day at its center. Balanced by an almost equally steady rate of calving at its face, holding its overall length essentially stable, while glaciers around the world retreated. Every few years, that advance would push the glacier's tongue far enough forward to seal off an entire arm of Lago Argentino, damming the water behind it until the pressure built high enough to rupture the ice barrier in a single, thunderous, days-long collapse. A spectacle so reliable that tour operators built entire itineraries around the anticipated timing, and tens of thousands of people would travel specifically to watch it happen. Standing at the main viewing platform for the first time, looking at a wall of ice rising some 70 meters above the water and extending who knows how much further below the surface, I understood immediately why the spectacle had become the centerpiece of an entire regional economy. The sheer physical presence of it made every tourist around me instinctively lower their voice, the way people do in a cathedral. I also understood, within about 10 minutes of Valentina actually explaining what she'd flown me out to help with, that the story I'd walked in with, advancing glacier, defies climate change, reliable rupture cycle, was no longer the accurate one. She walked me through the data that afternoon in the park's ranger station, printouts and satellite comparison images spread across a table clearly used for exactly this kind of briefing, and I found myself doing the thing I always do at work, translating unfamiliar information into risk categories I already understood, while she kept interrupting to make sure I wasn't smoothing over exactly the part that mattered. For roughly a century, and especially clearly across the 2 decades leading up to 2019, Perito Moreno had held its position with almost no net retreat, a genuine geological anomaly glaciologists had studied specifically because it seemed to be defying the same warming trend collapsing its neighbors. Since 2019, that stability has broken, and broken badly. Helicopter-borne radar surveys combined with satellite data going back 2 decades show the ice thinning at a rate roughly 16 times faster than its historical baseline, with retreat exceeding 800 meters in some sections. The glacier's famous closure and rupture cycle, the one the entire regional tourism economy is built around, has already begun to falter. The last full closure happened in 2018, and the only closure attempt since, in 2022, was weak and lasted barely a week before dissolving rather than rupturing in the dramatic way visitors had come to expect. Researchers now believe that if the current thinning continues, the glacier's front may be approaching a genuine tipping point where its ice loses firm contact with the underlying ridge that has anchored it in place for a century, opening the door to a much faster, much less predictable retreat than anything in the historical record. Valentina pulled up a side-by-side satellite comparison from 2019, and the most recent survey, the difference visible even to my untrained eye once she pointed to the right section of ice. I was wrong about something specific, sitting in that ranger station. I'd assumed, walking in, that the glacier that doesn't retreat was simply a fixed geological fact, a stable exception that would keep holding more or less indefinitely because it always had. What Valentina was actually describing was closer to a system that had been quietly accumulating stress for years before finally, visibly, breaking its own pattern, the kind of failure that looks sudden from the outside and looks, to anyone who'd actually been tracking the underlying numbers, like the entirely predictable result of pressure that had been building the whole time. I'd built 12 years of professional identity around trusting a well-documented historical pattern. Perito Moreno had just spent the last several years demonstrating, in real time, exactly how a well-documented historical pattern can stop applying without any advance warning that would show up in the pattern itself. The practical consequence of all this, the part that had actually pulled me across an entire hemisphere, was that the size and unpredictability of individual calving events chunks of ice breaking away from the glacier's face and crashing into the lake had started increasing noticeably, according to both the instrument record and the guides who'd spent years watching the glacier up close. Blocks the height of a 20-story building were now detaching with a frequency and a scale that had begun to genuinely alarm local glaciologists, wave action from the largest falls reaching further up the shoreline than the platform's original safety buffer had ever been designed to account for. The old protocol, built around decades of relatively predictable calving behavior tied to the reliable advance and rupture cycle, simply hadn't been updated fast enough to match a glacier that had Valentina introduced me the next morning to Tomas Ibarra, the ranger responsible for day-to-day platform safety decisions, a soft-spoken man who'd worked the glacier for 6 years and clearly considered every square meter of the viewing walkway close to personal territory. He walked me along the platform's full length, pointing out sections that had been closed and reopened multiple times in the past 2 years alone, as the safety team tried, in something close to real time, to recalibrate distances that had held safely for the better part of a decade before suddenly not holding anymore. At one spot he stopped and pointed out, almost casually, a stretch of railing that had been moved back nearly 10 meters from its original position after a calving event the previous winter threw spray further than any prior model had accounted for. He told me, without much drama in his voice, that the job had started to feel less like enforcing an established protocol and more like running a live experiment on himself, updating his own internal sense of safe distance almost weekly based on whatever the glacier had done most recently. I asked him how he decided when a given day's ice noise was ordinary background sound versus something worth actually reacting to. He said, honestly, that most days he still wasn't entirely sure, and that the uncertainty itself was the part nobody had trained him for. The night everything actually came to a head happened on my 4th day at the site, during what should have been, by every official metric, an unremarkable afternoon shift. I was standing near the ranger station with Valentina when Tomas's radio crackled with a report from the platform. A deep, sustained cracking sound running along a section of the ice face nobody had flagged as active, different in duration and pitch from the calving pattern the safety team's updated protocols had been built around over the preceding months. He was already moving before the second radio call came through. And Valentina and I followed at a distance close enough to watch what happened next without getting in his way. The crack Tomas found, standing at the platform's edge with a crowd of maybe 80 visitors still filming on their phones, ran wider and closer to the walkway than anything in his recent training scenarios. He had, by his own later estimate, somewhere close to 90 seconds before whatever section of ice that crack belonged to was likely to let go, based on nothing more formal than years of accumulated pattern recognition, that the mountain's new behavior had been actively degrading for months. There was no official rupture warning in effect. Nothing in the day's formal risk assessment justified an evacuation. The crowd in front of him was calm, engaged, entirely unaware that anything about the moment was different from any other afternoon at the platform. He had a decision in front of him with no comfortable version. Order an immediate evacuation of the nearest platform section, based on an unofficial, instinct-driven read of a crack that didn't match any confirmed prior event closely enough to trigger the automatic protocol, and risk being wrong in front of a crowd whose trust in the site's safety planning depended on evacuations actually meaning something, or hold, trusting a protocol he already knew, professionally, hadn't caught up to the glacier's new behavior, and risk being right about the danger a few seconds too late to matter. I watched him make the call in something close to real time, radioing a colleague to confirm the same section was showing unusual movement on a second vantage point, and then, without waiting for that confirmation to come back, ordering the platform's most exposed section cleared, walking the line himself, calm and direct, asking people to move back with the specific, practiced authority of someone who has learned exactly how urgent to sound without triggering panic. A few visitors grumbled, cameras still raised, clearly assuming this was routine caution rather than anything urgent. Tomas didn't argue with them. He just kept moving down the line, repeating the same calm instruction, until the last few stragglers had cleared the marked section. The confirmation came back less than a minute later, agreeing with what he'd already acted on. 90 seconds after the platform cleared, the section of ice let go a genuinely massive calving event. Larger than anything the safety team's older models would have predicted from that stretch of the face, sending a wave rolling across water that, an hour earlier, had been calm enough for children to lean over the railing pointing at reflections. Nobody was hurt. The wave reached the platform's lower railing and no further, close enough that several visitors later described the spray reaching their faces, far enough that nothing worse happened than a genuinely frightening story to tell afterward. Several people applauded once it became clear everyone was safe, the way crowds sometimes do after a scare resolves itself, though Tomas told me later that the applause had made him uneasy rather than relieved, since it treated the outcome as inevitable rather than as the direct result of a decision that could just as easily have gone the other way if he'd hesitated even 30 seconds longer. I stood there watching the water settle, the massive new iceberg still rocking in the lake in front of us, and understood, more completely than any data table Valentina had walked me through the day before, exactly what it means for a reliable pattern to stop being reliable in a way that still leaves real people standing exactly where the old pattern once said was safe. I was wrong about something else, watching the debrief that evening. I'd assumed, walking into this whole trip, that updating a safety protocol was fundamentally a documentation problem: collect better data, rewrite the manual, retrain the staff, and the system catches back up to reality. What I actually watched was a protocol getting updated in real time by a person willing to act on pattern recognition his own organization's official rules hadn't caught up to yet, and then, only afterward, feeding that decision back into the documentation everyone else would eventually train on. Tomas told us over dinner that he still didn't fully trust his own instinct in that moment, and that the job, over the past 2 years specifically, had taught him he probably shouldn't fully trust it, that the actual skill wasn't confidence, it was noticing fast enough, saying so fast enough, and being willing to be wrong out loud in front of 80 strangers, rather than quietly right after the fact. Once the immediate adrenaline of that afternoon had settled, Valentina had a few days left before my flight home, and she used them, deliberately, to show me the rest of the country the Glacier belonged to, partly because she needed the reset as much as I did, and partly because she wanted the specific, narrow lesson from the platform to sit inside something much larger before I flew home to redesign event protocols for crowds that had never once had to think about melting ice. We drove north to El Chalten, in the shadow of 2 granite spires that pierce the Patagonian sky with an almost violent geometry, Mount Fitzroy rising to just over 3,300 meters, and its sharper neighbor, Cerro Torre, close behind it. Both formed roughly 100 million years ago, when tectonic collision forced molten granite between existing rock layers deep underground. Wind, ice, and millions of years of glacial erosion since then have stripped away the softer surrounding stone, leaving the resistant granite core standing exposed like a sentinel over the ice field. The Tehuelche people who lived in this region long before European arrival called Fitzroy the Smoking Mountain, because clouds perpetually crown its summit, an illusion of volcanic activity caused by Pacific moisture forced upward against the Andean barrier. Watching the peaks catch a rose-to-crimson alpine glow at dawn from the edge of a nearly empty campsite, Valentina told me the mountains represent the opposite geological story from the glacier we just left. Not accumulation and collapse, but pure subtraction. Thousands of vertical feet of overlying rock stripped away over unimaginable stretches of time to reveal what had always been underneath. We flew north into La Rioja province a few days later to Talampaya National Park, where cherry-red cliffs rise nearly 150 meters above the desert floor. Iron oxide staining sandstone laid down some 230 million years ago during the Triassic period. The park sits within the same geological basin as neighboring Isigualasto, a UNESCO World Heritage Site whose exposed rock layers record an almost complete transition from arid to humid conditions across that same ancient period, preserving trace fossils, footprints, and burrows from some of the earliest dinosaur relatives ever identified anywhere on Earth. A researcher working near the visitor center that afternoon let us look at a cast of one such find, a small, unassuming footprint that predated every mountain range we'd stood in front of that week by tens of millions of years. Standing in a canyon carved by seasonal torrents that still occasionally flow through the region during rare rain events, looking at cross-bedding and ripple marks left by rivers that stopped existing roughly 200 million years before the first primate. I thought about how differently this landscape handled the same basic question the glacier had just forced on me. Not how fast is this changing, but how would you even measure change against a timescale this patient? Further north, on the High Puna Plateau at over 4,000 meters, Salinas Grandes stretches across more than 200 square kilometers of blinding white salt crust, the third largest salt desert in South America, its crystalline surface reflecting sky and cloud like a vast mineral mirror. The flat formed as the rising Andes trapped internal drainage systems with no outlet to the sea, concentrating dissolved minerals, mostly sodium chloride, but also, critically, lithium, potassium, and boron as centuries of meager rainfall evaporated faster than it ever accumulated. The crust itself averages over a meter thick across much of the flat, solid enough to drive a truck across, thin enough in places to reveal hexagonal crystalline patterns forming as brine migrates upward and evaporates at the surface. Valentina mentioned, almost as an aside, that this same brine reservoir now sits at the center of one of the most strategically important resource questions in the world, part of the so-called lithium triangle spanning Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, supplying a meaningful share of the raw material behind the global battery industry, and that local cola communities living around the flat have spent years pushing back against extraction plans. They worry will disturb a water balance that took geological ages to establish, and could be disrupted within a single generation of industrial pumping. Standing on that blinding white surface, the horizon dissolving into sky in every direction, it was hard not to think about how strange it is that a landscape this quiet and this ancient has become, almost overnight in geological terms, one of the more contested pieces of ground on the planet. We drove through Jujuy province next, into the Quebrada de Humahuaca, a gorge stretching roughly 150 kilometers, where the Rio Grande has cut through 600 million years of layered sedimentary and volcanic rock, exposing a spectrum of crimson, ochre, violet, green, and creamstone, each band recording a different mineral composition and depositional environment. Near the village of Purmamarca, the Cerro de los Siete Colores rises as an almost impossibly literal cross-section of deep time, roughly 75 million years of marine limestone, lake sediment, and river deposit compressed and tilted by the same Andean uplift that built the mountains around it, pink and red iron oxide bands sitting alongside white calcium carbonate layers from ancient lake beds and green copper-bearing stone. the whole hillside standing nearly vertical after tectonic forces folded what had once been flat, horizontal sediment into its current improbable orientation. A local guide, walking us through the market square that afternoon, pointed out that the gorge had served as a trade and migration corridor for thousands of years before anyone thought to name its individual rock layers. Its usefulness to people entirely dependent on the same geological accident that later made it beautiful enough to photograph. On the way south, we passed near Aconcagua in Mendoza province, the highest peak in the Western Hemisphere at just under 7,000 meters. Its summit capped with permanent ice, despite sitting at a latitude comparable to Morocco. The mountain isn't an active volcano, but the exposed remnant of an ancient volcanic system, uplifted and stripped bare by tectonic compression that began roughly 8 to 10 million years ago. Its resistant andesite and granodiorite core now rising into what climbers call the death zone, where atmospheric pressure drops to roughly 40% of sea level values. We stopped at a base camp staging area mostly full of guides prepping gear for the coming season, and Valentina told me guides here deal with a smaller scale version of exactly the problem we'd just lived through at the glacier altitude. Sickness doesn't always follow the textbook progression, and the most experienced guides are the ones willing to turn a client back based on a subtle change in behavior or breathing that doesn't yet match any official threshold. Exactly the same kind of unofficial, hard-won pattern recognition Tomas had leaned on at the platform. One guide, overhearing us, added that the mountain's non-technical routes make it deceptively approachable on paper, which if anything makes that kind of judgment call harder rather than easier. Since a client who feels physically capable of walking is often the hardest one to convince that something underneath the surface has already gone wrong. Near the end of the trip, we flew north to the border with Brazil, to Iguazu Falls, where the Iguazu River plunges over an escarpment nearly 3 kilometers wide in some 275 individual cascades, discharging, at peak flow, well over 10,000 cubic meters of water per second. The falls exist because of a precise geological contrast between resistant basalt caprock and the softer sandstone beneath it. Part of the Paraná Traps, one of Earth's great volcanic provinces, formed roughly 130 million years ago. As South America and Africa began rifting apart, dozens of lava flows stacking into a basalt sequence more than a kilometer thick in places. Dominating the whole system is the Garganta del Diablo, the Devil's Throat, a U-shaped chasm that channels nearly half the river's total volume into a single, thunderous plunge, mist rising off it constantly enough to sustain its own small pocket of rainforest microclimate. As blocks of that basalt break away from beneath, undercut by the softer rock eroding underneath them, the entire waterfall system migrates upstream at roughly an inch a year, meaning the falls, for all their apparent permanence, are technically still in the process of consuming the plateau that created them, just on a timescale too slow for any single visitor to register. On my last full day, Valentina and I flew south again, briefly, to Nahuel Huapi National Park, where Lake Nahuel Huapi stretches for 100 kilometers through mountain valleys carved by Pleistocene glaciers that retreated roughly 10,000 years ago. Mount Tronador, an extinct stratovolcano rising over 3,400 meters above the watershed, still holds 8 retreating glaciers on its flanks, including one darkened by sediment locals call the Black Glacier. Each one slowly eroding the mountain slopes with ice laden with rock debris. Standing at the lake's edge, watching afternoon light move across water carved by ice that finished its major work here millennia before anyone was around to measure it, I thought about how strange it was that the same fundamental process, ice advancing, ice retreating, ice reshaping stone on timescales ranging from 10,000 years to, apparently, the last 5 could produce both a landscape this settled and a glacier this suddenly unsettled, within the same country, within driving distance of each other. flew home 2 days later. Valentina stayed. Obviously, her actual work is there, in a way that made far more sense to me, having spent 2 weeks standing next to it than it ever had over conference hallway conversations. We talk more since the trip than we did before it, usually circling back, in one form or another, to some version of the same unresolved question neither of us has fully answered. How do you responsibly plan around a pattern you know, on some level, is only reliable until the exact moment it stops being reliable, with no guaranteed warning in between? She emailed me about 6 weeks after I'd landed back in Denver with an update from Tomas. The platform's safety protocols had been formally revised based partly on the incident I'd witnessed, expanding the buffer zone along the section that had calved and building in a faster, less bureaucratic path for rangers to order localized evacuations based on direct observation rather than waiting for instrument confirmation to catch up. He'd told her, in the same understated tone he'd used with both of us that evening at dinner, that he still expected to be wrong again, eventually, in one direction or the other, and that the job had stopped being about eliminating that possibility and started being about shrinking how long it took to notice when it happened. She also mentioned that the park had started publicly acknowledging, in its own visitor materials, that the closure and rupture cycle might simply not return in the form generations of tourists had come to expect, a small, honest admission that apparently took longer to approve internally than the safety protocol changes had. I don't think the lesson I took from that trip is really about glaciers. Not only, it's about how easily my own field had trained me to treat a long, well-documented historical pattern as something close to a guarantee, rather than what it actually is. The best available evidence, right up until the underlying system changes in a way the pattern itself has no mechanism for announcing in advance. Perito Moreno didn't send out an official notice before it started thinning 16 times faster than its baseline. It just did it, quietly, for years, until the accumulated change became impossible to ignore. Tomas's 90-second decision wasn't a rejection of protocol. It was protocol catching up to reality slightly faster than the paperwork could, because a person was standing there willing to notice before the number caught up. What stays with me most isn't the scale of any single site. Honestly, not Aconcagua's height, not the age of the Ixigualasto fossils, not even the wave from that afternoon's calving event. It's the image of Tomas walking the platform's edge in real time, calm and unhurried on the outside, running an internal calculation his own training manual hadn't fully caught up to yet, and choosing to act on it anyway. I think about how much of what actually keeps people safe at a glacier or anywhere else depends on someone willing to notice the exact moment a reliable pattern quietly stops being reliable, long before anyone gets around to updating the official version of the rule. I think, too, about every event protocol I've written back home around a reliable historical pattern, and how many of those documents probably have their own quiet Perito Moreno sitting somewhere inside them, still a few years away from anyone noticing. If this story changed how you think about what a reliable pattern actually promises, I'd genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Because somewhere on a Patagonian ice field right now, a piece of a century-old pattern is quietly failing to repeat itself, and the people standing closest to it are the ones who'll notice first, long before the rest of us read about it anywhere else. How many of the patterns we've stopped questioning are already starting to break, one unannounced measurement at a time? This narrative is told through the perspective of Noah Castellanos, a fictional crowd safety planner, and includes the fictional composite characters Valentina Rios and Tomas Ibarra. The geological and glaciological details of Argentina described here, including Perito Moreno's documented acceleration in thinning and retreat since 2019, and the weakening of its historic closure and rupture cycle, are real and presented as accurately as possible at the time of writing. The specific calving incident and platform evacuation described in this script are a fictionalized composite, not a documented real event.